crushing of Axis forces in North Africa was only the beginning. As the Allies mounted a victory parade in Tunisia, planning had already begun for a new campaign in the region: the invasion of Italy. The Allies had been divided over their next move against the Axis.
The American approach to strategy was very similar to their approach to business. Their overwhelming consideration was how to get the war over quickly so as to minimize the number of American casualties. And that was the way they thought. The fastest way to win the war, as far as they were concerned, was the direct route across the English Channel from Britain into France and so on to Berlin. And that seemed to them the logical strategy for which they pressed from their first involvement in the war. The British were very much more aware of the problems of mounting any such cross-channel attack and the penalties should it go wrong. The British were also much more concerned with the fate of Europe after the war. For centuries, the Germans and the Russians had contested control of Eastern Europe. Now the Western Allies were committed to the total defeat of Germany. That was the significance of the Casablanca Conference. At the end of it, the British and the Americans made what was called the Casablanca Declaration, announcing that they would accept no terms from Germany except unconditional surrender. But that meant inevitably that the Soviet Union would dominate Eastern Europe, and Churchill and the British were deeply concerned about that. Hence, the British proposal for an alternative strategy, to land first of all in Italy and then at the head of the Adriatic. Churchill, in one of his least appropriate phrases, called this the soft underbelly of Europe. In fact, it's anything but. It's the Alpine Redoubt, extremely hard country to fight through. But the idea was, by coming up from the south, to get to Vienna, to Prague, before the Soviet Union's forces, to try and hold the Russians as far east as possible to avoid their domination of Europe after the war. To the Americans, this made no sense at all. It seemed to them a risky strategy. It seemed a strategy of benefit only to the British, which could only result in more American casualties. Moreover, privately at least, the Americans considered that this strategy was based more on emotion and the British experience of the First World War. That Churchill wanted to show that his ideas for the Gallipoli landings of 1915 had been sound, and, as one British general put it to the Americans when discussing a possible campaign in France, "You are fighting the ghosts of the Somme." The Somme campaign of 1916, the other major campaigns of the First World War, had weighed very heavily on the British, and they were deep in the thought processes of the British as they considered this strategy.
Churchill won the argument, and the first target for invasion had to be decided. Corsica was an option, but the decision was eventually taken to invade Sicily.
This would give them a base for aircraft and for naval forces to be able to threaten further landings in the south of France, in Italy, even in Yugoslavia. So there was nothing wrong with that as a preliminary to a later change in strategy. Also, it was going to provide valuable experience in Allied cooperation and coordination and in the very difficult business of mounting amphibious assaults.
The Allies tried to convince the Germans that Corsica was the target. Elaborate deception plans were put in place, which had some measure of success. Meanwhile, forces were gathering for the forthcoming invasion codenamed Operation Husky. But first, the Mediterranean had to be made safe for the forthcoming armada. Two islands, Pantelleria and Lampedusa, had to be taken first.
Malta, the George Cross Island, stood up to thousands of heavy and concentrated attacks from the air. The Axis thought they could break Malta's spirit and cut it off from supplies. The Axis thought that with the reduction of Malta, they would finally cut the Mediterranean in two. Terrible damage was done, terrible hardship inflicted. Heavy losses were incurred in lives and ships. But Malta held on, and Malta was kept supplied. A map will show the significance of the island fortress, the importance of Malta's victory, and now the story is reversed. Pantelleria, Italy's Malta, and Lampedusa come into the picture, and they have not been able to hold on. It was a combined attack by the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the United States Air Force, and it proved more than the Italians could take. Closing the island, while aircraft formations were also going into the attack, the warship steamed at speed into striking range and struck. Shells tore into the Italian defenses while bombs hurtled down by the ton. The climax of a new experiment, the taking of a strongly fortified island by air-sea forces. And it succeeded. The vast clouds of smoke above the island told the story of the overwhelming assault. 5 days of scientific bombing and 3 days of pounding by the ships brought the story virtually to an end. The infantry force was ready to round off the story. That's part of it, standing by in various types of landing craft. And when they went ashore, covered by the guns of the Royal Navy and a moving barrage of bombs, they landed almost unopposed. Pantelleria, and a few hours later Lampedusa, eventually offered unconditional surrender.
The bombing had numbed the defenders into submission, and the Allied soldiers that landed had very little to do.
Prisoners at once began to give themselves up, marching behind white flags, and only too glad to do so. Our troops had plenty to do, such as mopping up among the ruins. And they lent a hand in looking after those civilians who had not been evacuated. They came from their dugouts looking quite a bit shell-shocked, as well they might. All this time, stragglers from the enemy forces kept coming in to surrender. They took the greatest care to make their intentions clear, too. Anything white was obviously at a premium. Evidently, they regarded the actual surrendering as rather a tricky business. But once they'd succeeded, their worried expressions changed to smiles. Apparently, they feel much safer under the Union Jack.
The capture of the islands gave Allied shipping an almost clear route through the Mediterranean. There were to be 26 landing beaches on Sicily, spread over 105 miles. General Montgomery thought that the Italian defenders would put up a fight for their home territory, and the terrain of the island certainly favored the defenders. Air attacks preceded the landings.
Palermo, on the northern coast of Sicily, has recently been one of the Allies' favorite targets. United States airmen have given the port a very thorough doing in their flying fortresses. The newsreel cameraman who went on this raid recorded strings of heavy bombs falling on shipping in the harbor. The attack was by no means unopposed, and a number of the big aircraft came home badly shot up. That one has lost the tail gunner's cockpit. The gunner himself fell out, but his parachute was seen to open, and he landed in the sea close to Palermo. Back at their base, the forts show what they had to go through to get the splendid results achieved. Another attack by flying fortresses, this time on Marsala, the important base on the west coast of Sicily. The targets were situated in the town itself and in the docks, and by the time the cameraman arrived, there was already plenty of evidence of the good work done by the leading aircraft. Clouds of smoke obscured large parts of the target area, which was already undergoing a heavy blitz. Marsala had plenty more to come. This is something the Italians didn't anticipate when they strutted into the European battleground in 1940. All they expected then was a share of the loot. Now the whole of their empire has gone, and they themselves cannot hope to escape. They can't even defend themselves in the air. And after Tunisia, their faith in Germany's power to defend them must be pretty badly shaken. Just as the taking of Pantelleria was a necessary prelude to the next invasion, so the capture of Sicily is itself a prelude to still greater operations. However the fortunes of war may go, the opening of the invasion went according to plan. Aircraft from Malta, only about 60 miles away, played an important part in that plan, of course. Fighters and fighter bombers took off from that much-bombed island for the attack, to harry the enemy and provide an air umbrella.
Convoys carrying the invasion troops sailed from North Africa and as far afield as Scotland. The resultant armada of ships and landing craft would be greater in scale than the first wave of landings in Normandy. At 2:45 a.m. on the 10th of July 1943, Operation Husky began. Some 2,500 ships containing 180,000 troops sailed towards the landing beaches, the largest seaborne operation in history.
I cannot go farther today than to say that it is very probable there will be heavy fighting in the Mediterranean and elsewhere before the leaves of autumn fall.
The invasion of Sicily by Allied forces under the supreme command of General Eisenhower has already initiated the beginning of that heavy fighting.
Bad weather initially hampered the landings, but as the landing craft reached the beaches, very little resistance was encountered.
All this time, the Royal Navy's guns had been pouring shells into the coast defenses, silencing enemy batteries and covering the landings. The landings were by no means unopposed, even if the option was less than expected. Shore batteries shelled the invaders, and a supply ship received a direct hit. The right flank of the 100-mile invasion line was in the care of the 8th Army, men from the United Kingdom, men of the most famous fighting force in the world. They too carried all before them, establishing a primary bridgehead and speedily consolidating. When Graham Thompson arrived on the scene, men and equipment were coming along in a steady flow. The shores of southeastern Sicily had been cleared, and more stuff was being landed.
Airborne operations did not go as well. The transports and gliders ran into high winds and were blown off course. Many of the resultant drops and landings were way off target.
History had been made, and incidentally a historic film record of it taken. There was even a moment to spare to take a shot of a few of the boys typifying the spirit of victory on the shores of Sicily. Already the coastal defenses had been overrun, and it was now a question of keeping stuff pouring into Sicily in a steady stream. Where rocks kept the ships a little way offshore, the boys could just about make it without swimming. The vehicles, too, came along under their own power as regularly and as smoothly as if the whole show was a big practice maneuver.
Wave after wave of troops waded ashore as the invading force grew in numbers. They began moving inland almost immediately.
The Allied forces moved inland, blotting out all opposition and securing captured territory at every stage. Digging in against possible counterattacks, mopping up snipers and isolated enemy outposts. It was reported that they gave us quite a bit of trouble. The first phase took the 8th Army up to Avola, Rosolini and Syracuse. And this film, which reached us some 10 days later, shows the occupation of those places. First, Avola. The Union Jack is hoisted from a high building in the main street. Not much damage appears to have been done to the town, probably because it was taken so quickly. Here, the 8th Army fell in with some American airborne troops, so they were able to compare notes. The Americans, who appeared to be in excellent form, were obviously making full use of local transport. As they were moving back after a happy landing near the town, they passed the memorial of the last war. That war in which the Italians chose the right side and the just cause.
The lack of any determined opposition spurred on the commanders. Monty himself seemed caught up in the euphoria, urging his troops to push further inland. The planners had expected some 10,000 casualties in the first week, but only 15% of that number were actually received. A useful means of transport was the American ducks.
Ducks, those American amphibians which proved so successful during the initial landings, have proved their worth on many occasions since. Each one is capable of carrying a load of 2 tons, and the time saved on transshipment is invaluable. Permanent landing facilities are scarce and usually not in a fit state for immediate use, but as our troops move up towards Messina, the supply ships and the ducks are never far behind. Straight from ship to beach and then on by road to our advanced dumps. Yes, the ducks are playing a vital part in the smooth working of our supply organization.
Three days after the landings, the whole of southeastern Sicily was in the hands of the Allies. German attacks were largely ineffective. Prisoners streamed past the advancing Allied troops, many of them looking relieved that their war was over. On the night of the 13th of July, 1st Parachute Brigade was dropped to capture the Primosel Bridge. This was vital for the advance towards Catania. They suffered heavy casualties, but the bridge was taken.
Approaching Rosolini, a little way southwest of Avola, where the Italians had hung out the usual Italian washing. As in Tunisia, they said it with sheets and things. The population seemed quite friendly and provided wine for the troops, who were only too glad of it. Fighting in Sicily in July is pretty thirsty work. And the troops gave away some of their chocolate ration, something the Sicilians hadn't tasted for a long time. Among the signs of battle were some enemy tanks which provided ample confirmation of the fact that there was every reason to bomb the Renault works when we did. Prisoners in Syracuse the morning after. Wait till Mussolini hears about this. But, signor, now I am on your side. Most of the Italians seemed to be glad to be out of the war. Anyway, they looked the same as most Italian prisoners have looked ever since Alamein. As they went aboard the landing craft on their way to Tunisia, one can imagine them saying the Italian equivalent of "any more for the Skylark." The foundations of victory in Sicily had been securely laid. Once more, the Allies were in full pursuit of the Axis, and this time on Axis territory.
The speed of the advance was hindered by a lack of transportation. The bulk of the transport was due to arrive with the follow-up convoys. Assault vehicles had been given priority. The infantrymen were marching fully laden in the heat of a Sicilian July. Any form of transport was requisitioned to aid the exhausted men.
AMG, the Allied military government of occupied territory, followed swiftly on the heels of our advancing troops. One of its tasks was the suppression of Axis propaganda. There, for example, is a typical enemy poster, John Bull as a repulsive octopus, its tentacles grasping the world. In its place goes Winston Churchill and a message to the Sicilians. And, of course, the clearing out of fascist party leaders was a prime job for AMG. After every town was captured, leading fascists were rounded up. Incidentally, let's hope that the ex-leader of all fascists will himself be rounded up in due course. Here's a shot of a German traitor, Fritzi the dog, He's attached himself to our military police ever since the advance through the desert. The only attractive traitor in existence.
Meanwhile, the Axis troops had been following plans for a steady evacuation of the island across the Straits of Messina. The defense of Sicily was not a priority, and the Axis troops would soon be needed on the mainland. As the soldiers of the 7th and 8th Armies pressed forward, liberated Sicilians would cheer them in the streets. However, snipers still posed a threat in some towns. The German forces on the island, under General Hubei, formed a defensive line across the island from Catania in the east to San Stefano in the west. This would aid the withdrawal of the Axis troops. 8th Army were ordered to move on Catania, and 7th Army were to move north to pierce the defensive line. Reinforcements were arriving on the beachheads to shore up the attack. The town of Centuripe was perched on top of a hill, and it was the key to the push forward. 78th Division were charged with the capture of Cherry Ripe, as the soldiers christened it. The town was defended by soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division, as well as Fallschirmjäger troops. Their ferocious defense of the town beat off a number of attacks, despite heavy bombing and shelling by the Allies. The assaults on the town degenerated into piecemeal attacks by separate platoons and even sections. As the Allies pushed up the hill, bitter fighting erupted on the outskirts of the town. House-to-house fighting ensued, and the town eventually fell. An attack on Catania across the plains would have been too costly. So the Allies would move round the north of Mount Etna to attack the enemy from behind.
The generals conferred just before our final drive on the Etna position. Alexander, Montgomery, and Patton planning the elimination of the Germans from their strong defensive lines.
The terrain was dry and mountainous. The difficulties the troops faced were to be a foretaste of trouble to come. The dust was dried by the Mediterranean sun. Volcanic dust still remained from distant eruptions of Mount Etna. Soldiers became coated with this dust as it mixed with their sweat to form an ashen goo. As the Germans fell back, they continued with their delaying actions, booby traps, mines, snipers, any device they could lay their hands on to hinder the advancing troops.
The fate of Catania was certain when General Montgomery's big attack was launched. The Germans were forced to fall back along the coast road towards Messina, and yet another milestone in the Battle of Sicily was passed. Without a shot being fired, men of the 8th entered Catania, or what was left of it, early on the morning of the 5th of August. The effectiveness of the Allied air attacks was clear to see. Catania had been battered by day and night for weeks on end, and just what it must have been like for the Germans can easily be imagined. The marshalling yards were a shambles. Not many supplies can reach the defenders by rail. Combined operations, in the widest sense, are certainly the watchword at the moment, just as they were throughout the Sicilian campaign. The Navy's part, for example, was not only the transport of the forces, but also the bombardment of shore positions. Cruisers stood right in near Acireale and let them have it, in broad daylight and into the night.
On the 16th of August, the first troops reached the town of Messina.
Americans were actually first in Messina, but men of the 8th Army were only beaten by a very short head, and cameramen were evidently well up in the race too. They found a bunch of civilians huddled near the entrance to the now famous tunnel shelter, waiting for the next air raid. As a matter of fact, thousands of people had been virtually living there throughout our bombardment of the city. Old Glory was hoisted at the municipal buildings. And down at the harbour, the Italian admiral's flag, what was left of it, was hauled down and an excellent substitution made. To all intents and purposes, Messina was a dead town after the great damage done to it. Witness the scene at the dock railhead. And the Sicilian ferry terminus. Yes, the harbour installations had been thoroughly dealt with. Shipping, too. This is one of the German evacuation beaches. Goebbels would no doubt call it a victory beach. Joy through defeat, in fact.
Operation Husky had succeeded in just 38 days. Now, across the narrow straits of Messina, loomed the next objective, the mainland of Italy and the Allies' first landings on continental Europe. Bombing of northern Italian industrial cities also took place.
There's a pretty bleak prospect facing Italy, too. While British troops and their allies knock out Axis armies in the Mediterranean theatre, smashing blows are also being struck by the Royal Air Force. Just as an example, take a recent raid on Genoa. Britain's heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, delivering the fourth hammering in 3 weeks on the great seaport and supply base. The war's being brought home to Italy with a vengeance. It was the second successive night of heavy bombing of Genoa, and wave after wave of our aircraft unloaded incendiaries and high explosives on what Mussolini himself described as the maritime lungs of Italy. All the hard work of our factories in the production of these mighty aircraft and the bombs they carry, all the hard training, the matchless skill and courage of our bomber crews are now reaping their reward in outstanding success on Italian targets. On this particular raid, great damage was done. Damage swiftly followed up until Genoa was virtually out of action. And on this particular occasion, an RAF cameraman recorded this picture of Genoa rocking and blazing under the shattering strokes of Bomber Command. This is what it looks like from the bomber's point of view. The target area clearly lit up by flares and fine weather giving an uninterrupted view of streets, railway, river and buildings. Now slowing up the picture, we can examine it rather more closely. big round lights are flares. On the right, bombs going down. Everywhere, fires burning, intermingled with incendiaries and HE bursting. On the left, bridges over the river Bisagno. Flying southwest, we cross the railway line. That semicircular building, top right, is 300 yards long. Fires and flares make it almost as bright as day. On the left, a stick of incendiaries bursts near the Via Palestro. That's flak coming up. Next, the inner harbour can be identified towards the right, low down, a semicircle of docks. We fly out over the sea. Turning to come in for another run. Fierce fires burning among the warehouses behind the docks. As the Lancaster leaves the burning city, still more bombs can be seen bursting. Two searchlights flash up into the sky and a stream of incendiary flak goes up. Finally, let's see it again at the actual speed. The bombing of Italy has also begun, as we know, by our American allies as well as by ourselves. Recently, raids were carried out from a Middle East base with liberators on the job and Naples the target. It's not just a nice little hop across the Mediterranean and back. As a matter of fact, the total distance to be flown is actually more than the distance across the North Atlantic. Obviously, fighters and flak are likely to be encountered over a great deal of the route when approaching or leaving the target, and the bombers fly high to deliver their messages to Mussolini and the Italian goats who follow him. And here go the bombs, right down on the docks and the quays and the shipping. High-altitude precision bombing, an American speciality.
The Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922. He had ruled Italy with an iron fist. Known as Il Duce, his fascist party had succeeded in improving the Italian economy and restoring prestige to his country.
200,000 fascists assemble at the Palazzo Venezia on the 16th anniversary of the founding of the fascist regime. Mussolini, the idol of the multitude, chooses the occasion to proclaim that Italy is prepared for any eventuality, that Italy is strong both in spirit and in arms. The cheering of the great crowd interrupts Il Duce, whose forceful speech referring to the critical situation in Europe evokes a solid expression of approval from the black-shot rank and file on their great day. Mussolini marches at the head of his staff to review the Italian Air Force in Rome. It is the 12th anniversary of the founding of the Fascist Air Department, a day devoted to military aviation and to just pride in the magnificent force that Italy has created. Il Duce stands on the tribune and observes the efficiency of the service he has built up. And the squadrons fly over in formation, dipping in salute, units from one of the finest air forces in Europe.
By the time Hitler came to power in Germany, Mussolini had been ruling Italy for some 11 years. The two men shared many ideologies. They had both supported Generalissimo Franco in the Spanish Civil War and had sent troops and supplies to aid the fascists. In the years leading up to the start of war, Mussolini had talked of peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to take this opportunity of addressing the English-speaking public to the medium of one of the most marvelous discoveries of modern times. I will speak to you in a few clear words of the chief problem which interests the whole of mankind, namely, peace or war. As the Prime Minister of the Italian government and head of the fascist movement, which has been ruling Italy these 9 years, and as a man, I wish to reject and repudiate all the futile chatter and information of those people who pretend to know that Italy wants to prepare for war. I fought in the war as a private soldier, among soldiers. I know what war means. With this double experience, how can anyone think that I should look without horror upon the eventuality of a war? Or nowadays, should it even break out between two nations alone, will fatally become universal.
But as soon as it became apparent that the Germans were about to win the Battle of France, Il Duce wanted a share of the spoils. So he too declared war on France. Mussolini had not expected the war to continue, and the following years showed the deficiencies in his armed forces. Despite attempting to expand his empire into Africa, the Italians and their Axis partners had been roundly beaten on the continent. Now, with the invasion of Sicily, Mussolini's days were numbered. The outskirts of Rome had been bombed by the Allies, and the Italian people were ever more resentful of Mussolini for bringing them into the war. Mussolini pleaded with Hitler for a settlement against the Russians in order to divert troops to the defense of Italy, but to no avail. On the 24th of July, his own fascist Italian Grand Council demanded his immediate resignation. The following day, King Emmanuel demanded the same. Mussolini finally accepted his fate and resigned after 21 years in power. He was immediately put under house arrest by the new regime. All of Italy celebrated. They thought they were finally free of the fascists. However, there was still the matter of their former allies, the Nazis.
The possibility opened up of an Italian surrender if the Allies invaded Italy. And for obvious political reasons, that was too good an opportunity to turn down. So what had been meant merely as a holding operation, the invasion of Sicily to secure the Allied position in the Mediterranean, suddenly became the preliminary to the idea of a major campaign to invade Italy. The difficulty was that the priority was now firmly the Normandy landings set for June 1944, and that very soon after any planned beginnings of a campaign in Italy, or resources, troops, would need to be withdrawn. If a campaign was to be mounted in Italy at all, it would have to be a secondary operation. It would not get priorities for equipment. It would not get the best backing of the respective countries.
The new Prime Minister Badoglio immediately started covertly seeking a peace deal with the Allies. However, the Italians wanted guarantees that the Allies would protect Rome from occupation by the Germans. The Allies demanded an unconditional surrender. The Italians, fearful of German retaliation, did not agree immediately. However, at this point, General Montgomery landed 2 divisions of 8th Army on the shores of Italy. The run-up to the invasion of mainland Italy had been preceded by heavy bombing of the landing areas. Communications and troop concentrations were targeted in raids by bombers and ground attack aircraft.
The war in the Mediterranean saw no lull in the air between the end of the Sicilian campaign and the invasion of Italy. Our aircraft continued the bombardment of the toe of Italy, while strategic attacks were being made further up the peninsula, notably in recent days at the Brenner Pass. Our picture shows action by Baltimore's against targets in the toe of the Italian boot. Softening up, they call it, in preparation for the troops to go right in.
As Montgomery visited his troops, ports and harbors on Sicily were filled with ships loading their cargoes of troops, weapons, and supplies. On the 3rd of September, 1943, Montgomery's 8th Army crossed the narrow straits of Messina and landed at Reggio in Calabria, in the toe of Italy. As in Sicily, they were met only by token resistance. The Italians were forced to sign an unconditional surrender, the first major Axis power to capitulate. It was agreed that the surrender would be kept secret until the 8th of September. The Allies hoped to confuse the Germans, but the Germans had already planned for this eventuality.
Now, for some time, the Germans in Italy, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had been aware of this possibility. And Kesselring had drawn up an operational plan under the codename Axis for what might happen should the Italians attempt to capitulate. So when the Allied attacks do start, the Germans are not particularly interested in resisting them. They are much more concerned about neutralizing the Italian threat, disarming the Italians, getting them out of the way, and in effect turning themselves into an army of occupation for northern Italy.
These, by the way, are the first newsreel pictures of men of the 8th Army landing on the continent of Europe at Reggio. As we've seen, the 8th Army had come a long way, but with their allies, they'd knocked Italy out of the war. To them goes the honor of achieving the first unconditional surrender by an Axis power.
The Italian fleet managed to avoid a German plan to scuttle their ships, and they steamed towards Malta to surrender.
The Royal Navy leads them in. The bulk of the Italian fleet got away and surrendered according to the terms of the armistice. After the loss of the Roma, sunk by German bombs, the Italians rendezvoused the Royal Naval Escort and steamed towards Malta. Warspite, Valiant and British destroyers heading the line. The rendezvous was at 9:30 on the morning of the 10th of September, and these pictures of the surrender taken by the RAF show the ships nearing the George Cross Island. The Italian warships had been ordered to fly a black pennant for easy recognition, as well as their own ensign. It wasn't long before the Italian Admiral Zara came ashore to report to our CNC. Honorable treatment was accorded, of course, and Zara saluted everybody as often as possible. But what a moment for Admiral of the Fleet Sir Andrew Cunningham. Nothing but surrender such as this could fully mark Britain's total naval victory in the Mediterranean. It was a moment that very few admirals can have experienced in the whole history of naval warfare. By now, of course, the rest of the Italian fleet had arrived. Some had come from Spezia, others from Taranto, and, well, there they were. Newsreel cameramen were soon out for a closer inspection. The Andrea Doria, an elderly battleship of the Cavour class, but modernized, 23,000 tons with 10 12.6-inch guns. And a sister ship, the Caio Duilio.
The Fifth Army landed at Salerno on September the 9th. They met much heavier resistance from the Germans. Luftwaffe attacked Allied shipping in the Gulf of Salerno. But the Allies managed to push inland. After 9 days of fierce fighting, the German troops were in retreat. Not all the way up the peninsula, as first thought, but to a new defensive line in the northern Apennine Mountains.
The Germans might easily have conceded the whole of southern Italy, all the way up to Rome and beyond, had it not been for the Salerno landings. The Allies had great difficulty at Salerno. They had to land on either side of a major river estuary, which made coordination difficult. And generally the Germans were so encouraged by the success they had in holding the Salerno landings for some time, that they began to argue that a defence of Italy further south was practical. And the further south they could hold the Allies, the more reduced the threat not only to Germany itself, but also to the German occupation of southern France, and also to the German occupation of Yugoslavia, which was critical not in itself, but to maintain German supply routes from Romania, which was a main source of oil. The Germans kept a number of divisions in Yugoslavia throughout the war until late on in 1944, principally to defend against the possibility of an amphibious landing coming from Italy, which shows that they at least took the soft underbelly strategy reasonably seriously.
The Fleet Air Arm played a notably important part in the assault on the west coast of Italy, where fighter cover was supplied by aircraft carriers as well as from shore bases. Seafires are seen at work during this operation. Landing on makes an amazing picture of arrival at high speed, followed by the action of the powerful arrestor gear. Every time a plane comes in must be a pretty tense moment for everyone concerned. Naturally, some landings on are smoother than others, and naturally accidents do occur. This Seafire has a fractured oil pipe, and oil on the windscreen is obscuring the view of the pilot. A pretty skillful job in the circumstances. Some damage, yes, but nothing that can't be repaired. The beaches were still under fire, but the job went steadily ahead, and the British and Americans pressed inland on the heels of the Germans, who were withdrawing according to plan, of course, in spite of all their boasts about another Dunkirk. The Battle of Salerno was rapidly being transformed into the Battle of Naples as our forces advanced east and northeast, and prisoners kept coming in. Germans at the double. Germans who look as if they still haven't learnt their lesson. The greatest handicap in the first phase, lack of airfields, was eventually overcome when the Germans were forced to abandon several, with in this case at least one Focke-Wulf 190 intact. Italian officers were most helpful in indicating the position of mines and booby traps and explaining the best method of delousing them. And while the 8th Army moved up the east coast and the centre to threaten the German left flank, the 5th pushed on towards Naples. Towns and villages were taken and occupied, and after our victory at Salerno, the pace began to quicken. Our forces, well equipped with guns and tanks and supplies of every kind, were on the march to Naples. The German plan was to delay. The British and Americans had the unpleasant job of dealing with enemy snipers. A tricky job calling for a cool head and a quick trigger finger. Italian civilians were extremely helpful on all these occasions. Here they're bandaging one of our wounded tank commanders and other casualties. But the German delaying tactics failed in their object of holding up our drive. True, their main body fell back in reasonable order, but the Allies were hot on their heels. We were soon in Pompeii, that ancient city, half destroyed by earthquake in AD 63, overwhelmed by the great eruption of Vesuvius 16 years later, and now a battlefield in 1943. Some of the boys did a self-conducted tour of the ancient ruins. A near miss in the theater. Everywhere they'd had half a chance, the Germans had done their damnedest in the way of demolitions. Any number of bridges had been blown, roads and communications wrecked. As usual, endless work for the REs. Still nearer Naples, the arrival at Torre Denunziata, 14 miles from Naples itself. There was a sort of triumphal entry here. This town at one time divided its energy between manufacturing weapons of war and making macaroni. Now, they just make whoopee. With only a few miles to go, the Fifth Army passed Mount Vesuvius, which is still displaying some signs of agitation, as it has done ever since the violent eruption of 1631.
Meanwhile, Mussolini had been freed from his incarceration by a daring raid by the SS and the Fallschirmjäger. Although Mussolini was old and tired, he was forced by Hitler to head a new fascist government in the occupied north of Italy. The push forward was tough, and the first British units did not reach Naples until the 1st of October. They found the port completely wrecked. The Germans had done their job well.
And they entered Naples ahead of the timetable. See Naples and die was the old and rather trite slogan for sightseers. But now the people of Naples, seeing the British and American forces coming in, well, they pretty well went mad. General Clark and the Fifth Army had arrived.
The Germans had been busy in Naples, wrecking the port and setting traps for the advancing Allies.
That was a time bomb in the new post office building in Naples. Newsreel cameraman Eric Barrow happened to be within a few yards of the building at the time, and he promptly reacted by shooting these scenes of the immediate aftermath. The Germans planted time bombs in many places in Naples and elsewhere before they left, and as at the post office, they've caused a number of deaths and many casualties.
Work began immediately on clearing the port. It was a vital landing point for reinforcements and supplies. After only 4 days, the first ships were landing supplies at Naples. Beyond Naples, the Allies were now faced with crossing the Volturno River. The weather had worsened, and heavy rains had swollen the river.
We are in process of taking the whole of Italy, General Alexander is reported to have said, and it's a slow process. With the roads mined and the bridges across the rivers blown up, the Fifth Army has still been making good progress. Beyond Naples, the River Volturno forms a natural obstacle, and of course the Germans made a thorough job of destroying the bridges. But the Fifth crossed the Volturno, and this is the story of how they did it. The first elements went over in infantry assault boats by night, but more were still going over in daylight. They formed the first bridgehead, establishing themselves in positions on the northern bank, driving the enemy back and clearing the way for engineers, British and American, to throw bridges across the river under cover of gunfire and smoke screens. Bulldozers were invaluable, as usual, clearing a good track up from the river bank. The whole job went like clockwork, and all the time bridges were being constructed, troops were constantly being ferried over to the other side. It wasn't long, in fact, before the first German prisoners from north of the Volturno were being ferried back. But the real thing was the bridging, and when a Husky bridge was well and truly completed, infantry and vehicles of every kind went over in a steady stream.
The Americans managed to cross with little resistance, but the British divisions had a harder time of it. Thick mud bogged down the armor on the banks of the river, and enemy fire was heavy. By October 14th, the Allies had almost complete control of both banks of the river, as the Germans continued their fall back to the Gustav Line. The Germans had natural allies in Italy, the weather and the terrain.
Even before the Second World War, military academy textbooks cited Italy as particularly easy country to defend. It's a relatively thin, narrow peninsula, very mountainous. The rivers flow either to the west or to the east. Anybody attacking from the south is faced with a series of river lines overlooked by mountainous terrain.
It was going to be an infantry war, with much of the terrain unsuitable for tanks and armor. These ridges and mountains would be easy to defend, so the Germans set up a defensive line known as the Gustav Line. Heavy rain would turn the countryside into torrents of mud, and snow would fall as early as October. Allied command had expected a relatively easy passage north. Now they knew that a bitter struggle lay before them.
So the Allies find themselves committed to an advance up the spine of Italy. But at the same time, some of their best commanders, including Eisenhower and Montgomery, are being withdrawn to Britain to help plan the Normandy invasion, taking with them some of their best troops and first claim on resources. The armies that are left behind, US Fifth Army under the American General Mark Clark, and British Eighth Army, now under the British General Miles Dempsey, form 15th Army Group under the British General Sir Harold Alexander. Now, these are not bad commanders by any means, nor are the troops under them of any way bad or open to criticism. But they are conscious that they no longer have first call on resources.
The worsening weather was now a major factor and would condemn the Allies to a grueling winter, fighting for every inch of ground. Allied command had expected Rome to be liberated before Christmas. This was now a distant dream.
And German casualties were coming back all the time. They received, as always, the same careful and humane treatment accorded by the Allies to all wounded on every front. Lately, heavy rain and that greater obstacle, mud, have done their best to hold up our advance. It's not a question of just blaming the weather. As you can see, it's a fact.